All right, let's begin. Dobro jutro. The majority of this press conference will be in English, though there will be some in Slovenian. I have just concluded directing a history tour of Slovenia with 25 tour participants, most of them from the United States. Between October 6 and October 13, we visited mass grave sites, former concentration camps, prisons, and heard from many experts in Slovenia. We have learned about crimes committed by communists, Germans, Italians, and Slovene home guards. This tour is and was not for profit. I don't believe in making a profit out of such a serious human rights issue. Many experts donated their time and expertise to this tour because they feel the same way. As a way of background, I'm an attorney, a former FBI agent, and I worked as an investigator at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia between 1994 and 1997. I interviewed approximately 1,000 victims of the war, victims of concentration camps, torture, rape, and I also worked with high-level policy witnesses. Afterwards, I've also worked with police and other officials in approximately 40 different countries, most often teaching or advising others on democratic-based policing and also writing new criminal codes based on democratic methods. I am now applying the knowledge I have gained over the past 45 years working professionally in this capacity to the situation of World War II in Slovenia. I am a dual Slovenian and American citizen. So I want to review the past 8 days of our tour and then also comment upon what we have learned. The first day, we visited Nova Gorica and the Trnovo Forest Plateau. We saw two mass graves in the Trnovo Forest Plateau from the post-World War II time, and this is where communists had killed local civilians as well as those who had fought against them. 80 years has gone by, but the people have still not been excavated from there. I cannot help but compare this to the crimes committed in Srebrenica, which I'm very familiar with, in 1995 in Bosnia during the war, where I conducted investigations all around Srebrenica. The perpetrators of those crimes were punished long ago, the dead were identified, and they were buried with dignity. What has happened in Slovenia? In early 2025, a civilian initiative was started in Primorska to excavate or dig up all of those who were killed. And these people include Slovenians, both partisans, home guards, Germans, and Italians. I have one great uncle who was also killed in the Trnovo Plateau. But most of the dead, my great uncle was recovered and is in the ossuary in Maribor, but most of them are still deep down in the karsts. From the perspective, from the outside, the international community, we cannot help but wonder what makes the Slovenian people care so little about their own people and their dead. Why can't we excavate them, identify them, and bury them properly? That first evening, we also learned about how UDBA, which is the former political police of communist Yugoslavia, how they operated. Its predecessor, OZNA, was responsible for carrying out the post-World War II murders under orders of Tito. When Slovenia gained its independence, employees and those surrounding UDBA unfortunately chose to destroy their own records rather than open them to the public, which would be a requirement in a real democracy. A real democracy requires transparency, reviewing the past, reviewing the mistakes, trying to correct them so we do not make them again. But rather than choose this path of openness, people who preferred the communist version of history chose the path of continued secrecy, and this still plagues Slovenia. Only about 10% of those records are available to the public today, unfortunately. The next day, we spent our day in Ljubljana. We visited the Museum of Contemporary History. We learned about Germany mobilizing Slovenians into the German army. Unfortunately, a very high percentage of Slovenians died while conscripted, and they were also not trusted by the government, the communist government, if they survived the ordeal and returned. I also have a comment about journalism, and I'm not criticizing those of you present, but just as a general observation, having worked with journalists for many years in other countries, primarily the United States, We had a panel discussion in the evening at Slovenska Matica, and some press were there, but very few. And those who were there did not ask any questions. Again, it's not a criticism of those present here, but considering the content of the material that we discussed, I cannot imagine in the United States the press not being peppering me with questions and the other panelists. It is just so very different than the press in most of the West. The press, and I'm talking about the press that is not here, I understand the liberal side of the press often does not come to these events, and am I correct in saying that they are not here today? Is that right? They do Slovenia no favors by ignoring this issue because it is just delaying the process of reconciliation so that Slovenia could move forward into a real democracy, which it does not presently have. And I even got an email from one journalist, no one here, asking if I could email him a photo of something that we had photographed. And I wondered, I was astonished because it seems to me to be lazy journalism. If you don't take the photograph yourself, how do you know that is what you're talking about? So just a comment on that. The next day we went to Kočevski Rog. On October 8, we spent the day visiting Jama Podklen and Masevnova Gorica, and then we watched the slideshow in the evening regarding the excavations, the victims, asked questions about DNA, what is preserved for future processing and DNA matching. Many of our tour members had relatives who likely died there, and some provided testimonies on video for our planned documentary. Unlike many Slovenians who only learned about the post-World War II killings later in life, those of us living in the United States have known the truth about these murders all of our lives. We grew up in a democracy, and we were free to learn about them and discuss them at will. The next day, we went to Brestanica Castle. I have a particular interest in this castle because, as it happens, the communist concentration camps that were run for women between 1949, 1951 and beyond held both of my grandmothers and two of my aunts. We had presentations from both museum director and Alenka Puhar, who I will ask to speak now. We learned from the museum director about how the Nazis deported Slovenians, and I invited Alenka Puhar to speak there as well, because having visited the museum before several times, I knew that the exhibit from 10 years ago did not accurately describe the women who were held prisoner in the castle's concentration camp. Alenka? Please. Yes, please.
Dobar dan, vsem po vrsti. Veseli me. Gospa Marija Velikonja me je, ko je začela razmišljati o tej ekskurziji, o obisku teh krajev, črnih točk v Sloveniji, me je skratka povabila, povprašala, ali bi bila pripravljena kaj povedati, in to na gradu Reichenburg, kjer je bil mnoga leta zapor, najprej za ženske, potem za moške in begunce in tako dalje. No, jaz sem se odzvala z velikim veseljem, ker sem se pač v mnogih letih, kar me te teme zelo zanimajo, marsikaj o tem naučila. Bila sem zelo velikokrat tudi na tem gradu, tako da sem v nasprotju z večino Slovencev, ki se trudijo ignorirati to temo, temu posvetila zelo veliko svoje pozornosti. Kaj sem jim povedala? Bom na kratko obnovila, kar sem jim povedala. Če se dobro spomnim, sem začela s podatkom, da ženski kriminal na Slovenskem nikdar ni bil poseben velik problem. Ni danes in ni bil pred drugo svetovno vojno. Zanimivo vojno, dogajanje v drugi svetovni vojni bomo spustili, ampak zanimivo je, vsaj zame, pa očitno za nikogar drugega, razen mogoče za Milka Mikolo, da je takoj po prevzemu oblasti strani komunistične partije število aretiranih, zaprtih, obsojenih žensk izjemno naraslo. Pred vojno v Sloveniji praktično ni bilo nečesa, kar bi se lahko imenovalo zapor za ženske. Kaznjenke so živele v samostanu in pod skrbstvom redovnic, nun. Ni bilo kaznilniškega osebja, ni bilo posebne policijske enote, ki bi skrbela za to, da ne pobegnejo in da opravljajo tisto, kar morajo opraviti. Tega ni bilo. Bila je ena tako imenovana kaznilnica v Begunjah in en majhen oddelek v Novem mestu in za to prevzgojo in oskrbo so skrbele nune. To se je po drugi vojni seveda zelo spremenilo. In da omenim številko, v Begunjah je bilo vsako leto recimo od 60 do 100 kazni. Ko pridemo v povojno obdobje in na grad Reichenburg, kjer so iz Begunj preselili kaznjenke leta 1948, kamor so jih preselili, imamo konec leta 1948 več kot 1000 zapornic, kar pomeni 10-kratno število v primerjavi s predvojnim časom. Podatek navaja Milko Mikola v svoji knjigi, to je edina knjiga, ki obdeluje fenomen kaznjenk oziroma obsojenk na Slovenskem. Moram poudariti, da ta 10-kratno število pomeni samo tiste, ki so bile obsojene. Poleg tega, da smo imeli v Sloveniji ogromno število obsojenih žensk, smo imeli še zelo veliko, vsaj 500, če ne več, tistih, ki so bile samo tako imenovano administrativno kaznovane, ne obsojene pred sodišči, civilnimi ali vojnimi, ampak pod nekimi prepoznane za zločinke pred nekimi majhnimi policijskimi komisijami. In k temu bi bilo spodobno našteti še tiste, ki so bile samo aretirane in so bile v zaporih na preiskavi. Te preiskave celo vrsto let niso bile časovno omejene, lahko je to eno leto. No, kako to? Režim, kakršen je bil v prestolnici, je najbolje popisan po moje v spominih Angele Vode, s katerimi, kot veste, sem se jaz ukvarjala, ki sem jih izdala. Tam noter je dost obsežno in natančno in verodostojno popisano, kakšno je bilo življenje na gradu. Razstava, ki smo si jo skupaj ogledali, je po svoje zelo ilustrativna za odnos Slovenije in Slovencev do tega poglavja naše zgodovine. Prva razstava na gradu Reichenburg je bila organizirana leta 1968 in je bila posvečena samo deportirancem v času nemške okupacije. To je bilo koncentracijsko ali zbirno taborišče za ljudi, ki so jih po Štajerski, pa po sosednjih pokrajinah Nemci zajeli in sklenili množično izseliti. Največ v Srbijo, nekaj v Hrvaško in v Nemčijo. Moral je priti padec komunizma in menjava režima, da so nekaj pozornosti nagrado začeli posvečati tudi trapistom, redovniškemu redu trapistov, ki je 150 ali nekaj takega let bilo lastnik tega gradu, kjer je bil pač njihov samostan. No, da so bili tukaj zapori in da je bil to glavni ženski zapor, so pa dojeli šele leta 1915-16, skratka leta 1900, vidite, meni se pozna, da sem iz prejšnjega stoletja. Leta 2016 so odprli razstavo v 2 sobah in pol, rečemo, in ta razstava ima, kar se mene tiče, nekaj nenavadnih potez. Na tej razstavi tako rekoč ni zapornic, pač pa so prikazane skoraj izključno samo paznice, ravnatelj pa tako naprej. Skratka, da vam jo predstavim, tukaj je v panojih 15 fotografij, na katerih nastopajo ljudje posebej. Od teh 15 fotografij ni niti ene fotografije kaznjenke, zapornice, niti ene. Od vseh teh tisoči v enem letu, a v drugem, v tretjem, v četrtem, v petem, niso našli ene osebe, ki se bi jim zdela vredna prikazati s fotografijo. Tako da, ko človek gleda to razstavo, vidi mlade ženske, tovarišice, v čednih novih uniformah, sedijo in se smehljajo v fotoaparatu. Vidimo kuharico z velikim štedilnikom, prijazno nasmejano v belem predpasniku. Vidimo, kako te mlade ženske igrajo odbojko, pa balinajo in tako naprej. Skratka, te zapornicam samim kaznjenkam ni posvečena nobena pozornost. Jaz vem, da je izkazovanje te pozornosti izredno težko, ker se jaz že desetletja in desetletja ukvarjam z iskanjem fotografij o zaprtih ljudeh, moških, ženskah, in jih še nisem našla. To je, če je nekje v udbovskih arhivih, ali je bilo uničeno, vprašanje, ali je bilo sploh posneto, ali ni bilo, mislim, s tem se temu jaz še nisem prišla do konca, ampak kakorkoli, če boste želeli kaj poštenega izvedeti o življenju zapornic, vam ni treba hoditi v Reichenburg. Hvala, Marija. To bi bilo približno vse, kar jaz lahko povem. Če pa bi kdo želel kaj vprašati, seveda naredim z veseljem tudi.
Hvala.
Hvala.
Hvala. Thank you, Alenka. Just to make a few comments about the same topic in English. I was also taken aback a number of years ago when I first visited the exhibit on the women prisoners in Brestanica. As Alenka said, there are no photographs of any of my relatives who were in there. I had one grandmother who was in solitary confinement for 3 years, tortured. There's not a word about her, no photograph. And I only found photographs in the books sold by the magazine that included photos of the guards, women working there happily playing games. And I just ask, as any member of the international community would look at this and say, imagine walking into a Nazi concentration camp, Dachau, Auschwitz, And instead of seeing bunkers of people, prisoners, emaciated, as we have seen in these concentration camps, no photos of victims, but they just have photos of the camp guards happily playing soccer. Can you imagine the outrage in the international community if they were to see that? Yet that's what we have in Slovenia at more than one museum. We also visited Sveti Ur, which was an outpost for the Slovene Home Guards during World War II. There is an exhibit there put together by the City of Museum of Ljubljana, which we read. However, the exhibit avoids discussion regarding the number of people the Home Guards killed there. It's a controversial number, between 100, 130, 1,500. 1,500 by many is described as an exaggeration because many partisans who were killed elsewhere may have been buried in Dobrunja. Of course, even torturing and killing one person, one soldier, one partisan, is a war crime and needs to be condemned. But it would help considerably to help Slovenia move toward democracy if the many dead buried in Dobrunja could be excavated and identified and counted. We visited the former concentration camp of Šentvid, which is currently a high school, which was used as a concentration camp after World War II for captives transported from Škofja Loka and then who went on to their deaths in Kočevski Rog. We learned in the school where the captives were held. The father of one of our tour members was held there and he escaped from there. We visited Trieste, where there is a very active group of Slovenians still living. We went to 2 Bazovica memorials, the first for 4 Slovene patriots who were executed by fascists in 1930. Then we saw the Bazovica mass grave, where partisans were responsible for executing Slovenes. Often in wars, as we saw, say in the 1990s, Yugoslav war, when I was at the tribunal in The Hague, people often tend to overlook the earliest crimes. People know that the Serbs committed the most of the crimes in the 1990s war in Bosnia. However, some of the earlier killings occurred in Croatia, where Serbian policemen were targeted by Croats. And there's about 20 very controversial deaths. And people often ignore the fact that these kinds of targeted killings are what often lead to the larger wars, because then leaders will politicize these killings and incentivize people to fight against their own. So both memorials are very important. We visited the Nazi concentration camp in San Saba, and we learned about the anti-communist, anti-fascist intelligence groups that spied on the Germans and provided intelligence to the Allies. I rarely hear this discussed in Slovenia, the fact that these small but significant anti-communist and also anti-fascist intelligence group were connected to the Home Guards. Home Guards, particularly in Primorska, helped gather the intelligence about the German military, gave it to intermediaries, who then took it to the British during the war. These people cannot be described as collaborationists with the Germans when they are spying on them. On October 11, we went through the flight of the refugees to Austria. Traveling north through the Ljubljana tunnel, we stopped at the former German concentration camp, which was used for forced labor, mainly of French prisoners of war who were forced to dig out the Ljubljana tunnel. We traveled to Viktrin, looked at what was the field where so many of our families fled to, and spent a number of years in the area in refugee camps. Very significant was the Bleiburg railway station, where in May 1945 the British disarmed the Slovene Home Guards and many others and repatriated thousands of refugees to Yugoslavia. Why do I say refugees? They were not prisoners of war. The Slovene Home Guard did not fight the British. They approached the British for protection. They turned over their weapons. and at that point they became refugees. You can also refer to them as military refugees. The Home Guards and others were forced onto trains at this railway station and to their deaths as they traveled in one direction or another to their final killing location. One of our tour members described how her father escaped by jumping off the train that he had been forced onto at that station and survived. We visited the Dubrava Cemetery in Maribor, memorial to the victims of Hurayama, who unfortunately, after having been excavated, still have not been buried properly or identified. Their status seems to be in limbo as politicians discuss whether they even have the right to be buried. We wanted to visit the ossuary, which contains the skeletons of the victims from Hurayama. We were not given access to it by officials, most likely because it is completely full to the top, and officials do not want to show us how many skeletons are actually in there. Within Dubrava, we noted the former Tezno tank pit, which once held 20,000 or so Croat victims who were killed very efficiently by OSNA within a period of a few weeks, shortly after the war ended. In Maribor, Kidričevo particularly, to me, is one of the most, a concentration camp that really stands out. It is a former concentration camp for ethnic Germans, many of them from Kočevje. In May 1945, the communists in Yugoslavia imprisoned 5,000 of their own people, ethnic Germans who had lived in Slovenia since 1400. And also they came from the northeast area of Slovenia, and is one of the worst death camps in Europe. Communists tortured the civilians by making them lay down flat in rows, riding over them with their bodies, torturing them in this way. But today, this former concentration camp is an asphalt parking lot. I went last year trying to find it, and I couldn't find it. There's nothing to identify it as a former concentration camp. When I walk into a former Nazi concentration camp, I see barracks, I might see rows, they might still have a crematorium. There's evidence, there's information explaining what horrific things happened there. At this location, there's absolutely nothing. It's a parking lot. The only thing remains is a single building, which is now a house used by someone, which has a plaque as a memorial to the concentration camp. It was a classic form of ethnic cleansing from World War II. And we saw ethnic cleansing in Bosnia everywhere in the 1990s. And the reason we saw this in Bosnia is because these crimes have not been fully explored, discussed, resolved, reconciliated. And so these kinds of crimes are going to repeat themselves and into the next war if people do not discuss them now. At the Celje Museum of Contemporary History, we learned about events in Celje during and after the war in 1945. They have an exhibit specifically dedicated to 1945 at this time. It shows Germans deporting Slovenian civilians and taking children away from their parents. It explains that the German army, the Germans, were different than the Italians, in that Italy was not interested in erasing the Slovenian people and culture where the Nazis were. The Slovene Home Guard had no real presence in Celje. At the end of the war, thousands of Yugoslavs who fled Tito were disarmed and sent back to Yugoslavia as refugees, but many of those eventually killed by the communist government went through Celje. And as a result, it still has many, many people still underground, unidentified, and undiscussed. We visited Petriček, where several hundred children were taken from their parents or orphaned by Teherje. For the most part, they were sheltered there until they were placed into other homes. These children did not fare well, we learned in life. They were always treated as lesser citizens. They never learned who their parents were, and a high number of them committed suicide. On October 13, we went to Hurayama. We were granted access to Hurayama into the mass grave tunnel, and we were told we were the first international public tour in history to ever gain access to it. 1,450 refugees and civilians were forced into this tunnel over a number of days and shot. As we walked the 500-meter length inside the tunnel, it gave us a sense of how far the communists went to conceal their crimes, because they constructed 11 barriers. And it's not just a barrier. One of them is 11 feet long, and the barriers start from one point and it goes by the 11th barrier, it's 300 meters later. It took 3 years for forensic specialists to sort out the skeletons, and the mass grave is frequently described as being discovered in 2009, even though many people in the area living there, they all knew about it. Many of those of us in the United States already knew about these killings, the general area. My uncle, Tina Velikonja, used to drive me around the area, says, I think they're somewhere in here. And this is in 1994, long before they were discovered. Why does it take so long to become public? Because Slovenia refuses to discuss these crimes. They prevent people who know from speaking about them. They're under threat of arrest or worse. And they still debate 18 years later whether these people have a right to be buried at all. At the Skofja Loka Castle, we learned that the communist-run post-World War II concentration camp was one of the worst in Slovenia. Around 8,000 disarmed former fighters and civilians spent 1 to 2 weeks there and were tortured and interrogated. Many of the torture methods described by witnesses are similar to the torture methods that I heard hundreds of times described by witnesses in the 1990s war in former Yugoslavia. Why is it we're repeating the same torture method? Why are we using the same methods in war? Because we're not learning from the prior wars, and we can't learn if we don't discuss them. Slovenia didn't learn its lesson from the prior wars, and it's likely to repeat mistakes in the next war. Most of the captives were then taken to the Šentvid concentration camp. I have some additional observations and recommendations. Words matter. Professionals in Slovenia are afraid to speak directly, even when I ask them direct questions, because they fear repercussions of losing their jobs. I have observed this repeatedly, not just on this tour, but in my many, many other visits here. Since I don't have a job to lose, I will say it for them. The post-World War II killings were a crime against humanity. There's no question about this. As Jože Desmond describes, there are 15 Srebrenicas or more. 100,000 or more people, mostly refugees, not POWs, who had fought communists, were systematically tortured and murdered by the new communist authorities. There was no mass uprising by the people as far as the direct killing of these people. The murders were planned at the top levels of government and carried out by people who were hired, obtained, mainly because of their ability to kill efficiently and without remorse, and they did that. You cannot describe some of these killings, the Tezno tank pit, how rapidly they killed people, as anything other than a systematic frenzy or order with people who have no issue carrying out killings in such a fast and efficient way. Sometimes I read or I hear Slovenian professors, not legal professors, but in other disciplines, quoted in the paper saying that the mass World War II killings could not be a crime against humanity without explaining it. Recently this year I read that. These professors do not understand international law. There's just no dispute about it. It was a crime against humanity. There are strong arguments for making the case that it was also genocide. And I say that recognizing, of course, as a lawyer, that genocide is determined at the court. So I will not say it's genocide because it has to be determined in a proceeding. But the high degree of torture used and planning for it makes a strong case that the court would consider ruling it as a genocide. Slovenia needs to openly admit that the communist government of Yugoslavia committed crimes against humanity. The British also need to admit that they share responsibility for that crime. They put the home guards on the trains. There were partisans present and on the trains armed. They share their part in this crime. I want to say clearly that there are 3 forms of totalitarianism that have been identified since the 20th century and on. Fascism, Nazism, and communism. All 3. The term collaboration is used frequently by people who are sympathetic to the former communist government to somehow justify that crimes against humanity, this mass murder of over 100,000 people, including Slovene home guards, is somehow justified. There's no justification for such crimes. There were no trials. It doesn't matter. They could have all been SS officers. It's still a crime against humanity because they weren't tried. And of course, they weren't Nazis. None of them deserved to be killed without a fair trial. Even if all the victims, as I said, were officers, these murders are not justified. Post-World War II Slovenia held a number of communist concentration camps. I see in numerous museums, because I do visit the museums in Slovenia, not just during the tour, that they are usually referred to as prisons, reform centers, but most of them fit the definition of a concentration camp. And when it fits that definition, we need to use the correct terminology. These were concentration camps, and the communists ran numerous concentration camps. And again, on the museums, they have a responsibility to inform the public about the crimes committed by the communists. I see over and over again exhibits, excellent exhibits, describing the crimes that the Nazis committed during World War II. Slovenia clearly knows how to put together a professional museum exhibit. However, that is rarely seen when we are talking about communist crimes. Slovenians and the museums need to work to bring the standard up equal to the standard that they have already met when discussing Nazi crimes and fully discuss the crimes committed by the communists. That's all I've planned. Do you have any questions? Please, press.
I will save my questions for the interview with you.
Okay, very good.
Will you organize another tour in Slovenia, likewise?
Will I what?
Organize another tour.
If people would like me to, I would be delighted to. There are many areas we have not been able to explore because unfortunately there's so many more crimes that we weren't able to talk about. So I'm open to it. Do you have a suggestion about the tours? What do you think should happen?
I think the tour should be organized for Slovene pupils.
I would be delighted to do that, and I need to be educated on how best to advertise it within Slovenia, and now I have more people with whom to consult on how to do it.
Maybe you should also know the facts you have mentioned here are publicly known.
Yes.
But in Družina, in few magazines, but not in the mainstream press.
Right.
Why?
It's one attempt I have is this is why I'm doing this in English, and because I often think that the international community cannot examine it because they don't understand Slovenian. Even Serbs and Croats don't say they don't understand Slovenian. So I would like to see more in English so that more people can view it. That's part of the reason. One idea I had for a tour was to do one-day tours in the summer of all the tourists that come to Ljubljana and take them to Kočevski Rog or Hurajama one day. Just like people, when we visit Munich, we might go to Dachau one day. Something like that. That's one idea I have. Okay, if that's it, I'll turn it off.